Wake up to Ara under the sun. Ara under the sun.
This story was told to me by a comrade of mine. He didn't want me to mention his name, so it will be anonymous. This happened a few years ago. When he was active in the army, he was stationed in Germany and was sent out on a specific mission in Germany's Black Forest. He told me that he was in a squad of 8 highly trained soldiers. They were dropped in a remote area of the forest by helicopter, and their mission was to tranquilize this creature, then airlifted out of the location, he said. His superiors described it as a large, bipedal wolf-like creature that is approximately 350 pounds in size. It's extremely fast and extremely dangerous. If provoked, they showed them surveillance footage of this creature attacking a small German village and killing several people, he said. It was extremely fast and agile. It jumped over a 6-foot fence in one leap and ran through the woods like it was nothing. He said they were dropped off in the forest at night by helicopter. They had to hike about an hour until they found the exact location where it was last spotted using thermal imaging. Then they set up their gear and began to wait for it to appear so they could tranquilize it with darts from their rifles. They sat there all night, but never saw anything except wildlife, such as deer, foxes, and owl. About 500 a.m. Before dawn, they were getting ready to move out, and that's when he said all hell broke loose. The creature appeared in front of them, out of nowhere. He described it as being 7 feet tall, covered in dark brown fur with black stripes on its arms and legs. Its face looked like a wolf's face with pointed ears. It stood there, staring at them for about 5 seconds, and then took off deeper into the woods. Several members of his squad fired, tranquilized, or darts at it, but it didn't seem to faze it. They began following it deeper into the woods. He said they were tracking this creature for about 2 hours when it finally stopped running and turned around to face them. He said it let out this blood-curdling scream that he described as sounding like a mix between a wolf and a human. He said it was so loud and so terrifying. He's never heard anything like that before, and he's been in combat several times. Then the creature jumped into a tree and climbed up about 30 feet. The soldiers were shocked by this. They had tranquilizer rounds that could stop a grizzly, but none of them would even faze this thing. They fired at least 3 more darts into it, and after 30 seconds, it comes crashing down, breaking the branches before landing on the ground. With this huge thud, he said it was still not totally out and groggy, and it was showing its teeth at them while they were surrounding it. They radioed in for the helicopter, and then they put this creature on a very thick net and were able to airlift it. In the next 30 minutes, he was up close and personal with this thing for about 30 minutes before the helicopter came. And he said it was the craziest thing that he's ever seen. It had these huge tendons on its legs, like it was built to jump 20 feet in the air. Its back and chest were very muscular and very overdeveloped for its body, and the smell was just awful. He said it was hard to get close without vomiting. There was never any follow-up with the soldiers. After that mission, he had no idea where they took it or why they took it there. They probably took it to some German-based lab. I'm assuming to run further tests 2 years ago. I moved to Traverse City, Michigan for work. Things were going well with the new job, and I was confident I'd be at the company for a while. So after living there for a year, I also bought a small lake house on the upper edge of Lake Michigan. It was a small, basic cabin, but it was good enough for the weekends away, and for a few weeks of the summer, I bought the cabin in the fall. But I only got to spend a few weekends there. Before that winter, I had 2 huskies, and they loved the cabin. Finally, my first extended stay was in July when I took 2 full weeks of vacation. I spent the first days walking the dogs along the lake shore, canoeing, and just hanging out, relaxing. It was just what I needed. Occasionally, I would walk the dogs through this wooded area behind the cabin, but I didn't do it much, because nearly every time I did, the dogs caught scent of something that caused them to go berserk. They were normally really chill dogs, but they would start barking and pulling on their leashes like crazy. I'd have to drag them out of that area, and even then they didn't calm down until we got back to the cabin. I assumed it was something like a family of raccoons, because a few mornings I had found my garbage cans knocked over. Then one night, I woke up in the middle of the night by the dogs. They were barking like crazy, and it seemed like they were trying to break down the back door. I turned on the light to look outside, but I didn't see anything. I got the dogs back to the bedroom and locked the door. Eventually, they settled down, but just as I was getting ready to go back to bed, I heard it. It was some kind of howling noise. That must have been what set the dogs off in the first place, and I just missed it because I was asleep. Having huskies, I was more than familiar with dog howls, but it wasn't that type of howl. It wasn't a canine howl. It also didn't sound like coyotes or anything else that I've ever heard before. I made sure all the doors and the windows were locked tight, and then I went back to bed, glad to have the dogs as a warning system. The next day, I stopped in the general store to pick up some supplies that I had forgotten to bring the cashier. Was an older man and very friendly and chatty, so I decided to ask him about the howls that I heard the night before. I asked if he knew of any wolves in the area or something similar. When I did, he gave me this really weird look. After a long pause, he told me that the townspeople talk of a strange animal in those woods and that no one had ever seen it, but folks would occasionally call the police after hearing the sounds or after having trouble with property damage. He specifically told me to always keep my dogs on their leashes, because in a few rare instances, pets had gone missing. I went back to the cabin more than a little concerned. I had bought that cabin as a refuge, a place to get away from work stress in the city. The last thing I wanted was to be worrying about some wild animal attacking me or my dogs. Over the last year, I became friends with a few of my coworkers, and I knew one had grown up in the area. I gave him a call that day to see if he knew anything about this local legend. When I told him what the old man said, he just laughed. It had been some kind of folk tale that he had heard as a kid, but it wasn't real. Some kind of Bigfoot creature. He suggested that I do what? The guy said, and just keep an eye on the dogs, but otherwise not to worry about it. Feeling a little bit better, I let it go. The rest of the week passed without any issues. But the night before I left, the dogs woke me up again. This time they were barking and scratching at the door. Frustrated, I turned on the light and looked out again. I had put a canoe inside and next to the door the other day, just in case I needed it. I picked it up and I stepped outside. I didn't go more than a few steps. I wasn't that crazy, but I wanted to see if there was anything out there. As I got outside the cabin, I could hear a sound, not the howling sound from earlier, but a heavy breathing sound. I was starting to wonder if there was just a stray dog in the woods. It would explain the scavenging and the way my dogs had reacted. I stood near the back door, waiting and watching. At this point, I just wanted to know what I was dealing with. All of a sudden, the dogs flipped out again, barking and yipping from the bedroom. I jumped, startled. I turned to yell at them when I saw something darting around the side of the cabin. It was outside the circle of light, so I could only see a tall shadow. I held up the oar as a sad weapon and stared into the darkness. This creature crept closer to me until I could finally see it more clearly. I was awestruck. It was this huge man, covered in dark brown fur. It almost looked like a cross between a bear and an ape. It was so muscular and so huge. Then it opened its mouth, and it let out this terrifying roar. I could see all of its teeth as it tilted its head back. Without thinking, I chucked the oar at it and dove back for the door. I slammed it shut and locked it and pushed a small kitchen table in front of it. Then I ran back into the bedroom and closed and locked that door. I huddled in that room with the dogs. Until morning, I didn't sleep a wink that night and occasionally heard sounds around the cabin. But I count myself as lucky that that thing didn't try to come in the morning. I packed everything up and ran for the car, and I got the hell out of there. On my way out of town, I stopped to see that old man who was the cashier at the general store, and I told him what I had seen. He gave me a half grin and told me it was only a matter of time until it came back again. Before I became a teacher, I had a short-lived career as a park ranger. I had grown up in a heavily forested area and had been an avid hiker and a camper, so it seemed like it would be a fun and easy job. Right after college, I got hired by the National Park Service and had a brief placement in Utah before being relocated to Tennessee, specifically the Smoky Mountains. It was a beautiful area, and I was looking forward to spending the summer there. Instead, I got the summer of hell. It started well enough as a newbie. I was doing a lot of patrolling and routine safety checks, which was fine by me. I got to roam around the gigantic park and sometimes going hours without seeing anyone a few weeks in. I got the first weird call. A family had reported animal tracks around their site. It wasn't a big deal. All parks have wildlife. But when I got there and saw what I saw, I thought one of the other rangers was messing with me, that maybe it was a hazing thing for a newbie me. There were tracks, but they were weird. They definitely weren't canine or bear. They were human-shaped but huge. And with claws at the end, I checked out the area and took some pictures, and then helped the family get another campsite. I turned the pictures into my boss, expecting her to laugh and give up the joke. But instead, she was pissed. She thought I was the one playing the joke. I asked her to come out to the site with me, but by the time we did, the rain had washed away the prints. 2 weeks later, I got another call. This one was worse. The campsite had been completely trashed. The tents were shredded and everything was destroyed. Luckily, the campers hadn't been there at the time. This camp was in a grassy area, so there weren't any footprints, but I did find some light brown tufts of fur on the ground. This time, my boss saw the destruction herself, but she marked it in the books as a bear attack. The fur didn't look anything like a bear's, though it was much longer. Finally, in early August, I got a call about a lost pet. A young couple had been walking their dog, and it had slipped its collar and taken off into the woods. They were devastated. A few of the other newer rangers and I got picked to head into the woods and try to find the dog we broke off into pairs. And I was teamed up with this guy named Brian. He was a decent guy. I had sort of become friends with him the last few months of working there. We walked for about 30 minutes, doing our best to cover our area. We whistled and called out, but didn't see any sign of the dog. There were 2 hours left of daylight, and we hadn't gotten any other pressing calls, so we agreed to stay out until dark before going back to the parking lot. As the sun started setting, we turned around and made a bind for the nearest trail. We still had maybe 20 minutes or so until we got to the trail, and then we would have another 15 minutes on the trail itself. We felt bad about not finding the dog, but there was nothing else that we could do. Halfway to the trail, we started hearing these noises, growling sounds, a low howl. The missing dog was a lab, and they didn't howl like that. It was almost dusk, so inside the forest, it was getting difficult to see. We looked around but couldn't identify the source of the sounds. We kept walking, hoping to leave whatever it was far behind. At the time, Brian and I noticed this odd-looking tree. It looked like it had been mauled, huge scratch marks and missing branches. I pulled out my flashlight and looked around the base of the tree. There again were these huge footprints, and they weren't a bear's. They were just like the ones I had seen months ago. They were huge but human-like claws at the end, and narrow this time, though someone else was seeing them with me. Brian's eyes got huge, and he started swearing. We were suddenly very aware that we were alone. In the forest, it was nearly dark, and we were still far from help. We picked up our pace, going as quickly as we could into the twilight. We kept hearing these crashing sounds and grunting sounds, but kept moving twice. I saw a dark shape run past, but the trees made it impossible to see what it was. It was large and tall, which was concerning to say the least. We were nearly running. As we approached the trail, or where we thought the trail was, we had to be within yards of it when the creature barreled out of the woods and crashed right into us. I had a glimpse of a dog-like face before it knocked me and the Brian, and we went tumbling down the slope together. We rolled for seconds before hitting a tree. I looked back up the hill to get a better look at what had come at us. Staring down at us with these glowing eyes was a creature I thought only existed in people's imagination. It continued staring at us and growling. As we locked eyes, drool was dripping from its mouth, which had me petrified. Brian was frozen too, staring at the creature with its dark matted fur towering above us. Then in the next second, it took off running into the woods. Finally, I snapped to and grabbed a large branch for a weapon, and Brian and I limped out of the forest, bruised and sore. It was well past dark. By the time we got to the parking lot, the other rangers were waiting for us. They were worried and asked why we were so late under the lights. They could see that we were totally scraped up, and we explained what had happened before. They could even respond. I showed them the shallow claw marks on my shoulder where the creature had hit me. I told them it was some kind of dog or wolf walking upright, because I had no idea how else to describe it. Even though I had Brian backing me up, no one believed us. My boss was just pissed at me again and threatened to reassign me. Instead, I quit. I had enough of whatever the hell this thing was roaming in those woods. Coincidentally, the missing dog was never found.